it's such a pleasure, it's such an honor. One of the joys of doing what I do is opportunities to meet the people that have affected you. And one of the people who have affected me by her work is Heather McDonald. You know, when I met her for the first time earlier, I said to her, well, shall I mention the City Journal? She said, nah, that's boring. I said, well, shall I mention it? She said, nah, that's boring. I said, well, what about the fact that you're the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute? She says, nah, that's boring. I said, well, what do you want me to say about you? She said, I got a new book. It's coming out, I do believe, in September, and it is called The Diversity Delusion, and there's actually another book that you've written, which is The Burden of Bad Ideas, and what's so odd, that deserves a round of applause. Because the burden is never paid by the people who have the ideas, the intellectuals who isolate themselves either on college campuses and protect themselves with all sorts of rules like academic freedom or tenure, and the people in government who exclude themselves from the rules they make. It's always paid by the people who work hard, and it's suffered the most. They think they're progressive, but they're regressive. Everything they do is regressive. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my spiel. Let's listen to Heather McDonald. She's a lot smarter than I am. Please, Heather.
Thank you very much. This is an honor, and I'm humbled. I knew that the American Freedom Alliance was plucky. I knew it was courageous, but I didn't know you guys had so much stamina. Thank you for waiting. It's one way to beat the traffic in LA. I hope at least you'll be able to zip home on the 405 or the 101 without as much nightmares as you usually encounter. I've been speaking on college campuses recently. You know what that means. I've received the walkout, the storm the stage strategy, and at Claremont McKenna, the blockade that prevented anybody from actually attending my speech. Students of color, as they call themselves at Pomona College, announced that I was a, quote, fascist, white supremacist, war hawk, transphobe, queerphobe, classist, and ignorant of interlocking systems of domination that produce the lethal conditions under which oppressed peoples are forced to live, end quote. So to actually have an audience still in its seats and apparently willing to listen is a novel experience that may take me a while to get used to. Now, at these other venues, I was speaking about the police. Tonight, however, I'm going to address the root cause of such totalitarian thuggery, the narcissistic victimology that has taken over college campuses and that is rapidly spreading through our culture at large. The American university is in the grips of mass hysteria. Students actually believe, get this, that they are victims of oppression, at risk of their lives from circumambient racism and sexism. The degree of maudlin caterwauling is impossible to overstate. At Brown University, so-called students of color occupied the provost's office and demanded to be exempt from such typical expectations of students as attending class or studying for exams because they said they had to focus so hard on staying alive at Brown. At Yale, a mob of minority students surrounded a highly respected sociologist and cursed and screamed at him for 3 hours because his wife had sent an email suggesting that students can choose their own Halloween costumes free from the tender ministrations of Yale's discrimination police. Among the shouts of, and this is quotes now, not me, shut the fuck up, and you are disgusting, that were directed at this mild-mannered, highly progressive left-wing professor, was a cry of, we're dying, from one of the ranters, referring to the allegedly endangered status of Yale's minority students. But my favorite moment in this parade of self-pity came from Princeton. You may recall the 2015 Black Lives Matter protest that swept university campuses in the fall of 2015. Well, at Princeton, the black students chanted, We're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Now, who first used this phrase? Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was a civil rights activist who was beaten for trying to vote in Selma. She grew up in a sharecropping family in Mississippi, picking cotton. Fannie Lou Hamer had grounds aplenty for being sick and tired of being sick and tired. But any Princeton student, I don't care if he's purple, green, or orange, who thinks of himself as oppressed is in the grip of a terrible delusion that will poison him for the rest of his life. Now, perhaps you're thinking, well, at least the adults on campus are trying to give students a firmer grip on reality. Ha! To the contrary, the adults actively encourage the hysteria. A massive and spreading diversity bureaucracy is devoted to cultivating in students ever more arcane species of self-involvement and ever more preposterous forms of self-pity. Students regularly act out little psychodramas of oppression before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets and vice provosts of equity and inclusion, who use the occasion, of course, to expand their dominion. Many campuses have created so-called bias response teams, presumably on the model of active shooter teams, on the assumption that discrimination is so rampant and lethal on campus that a rapid defense force is needed. Freshman orientations and dorm sessions invariably feature seminars in toxic masculinity and white privilege. Students are taught to think of themselves as either the oppressed or the oppressors. If you're not female, black, Hispanic, gay, or any of the 116 still metastasizing categories of gender, the only way you can escape being an oppressor is by becoming a, quote, ally. Now, allies are something that is usually associated with war. And indeed, the reigning thinking is that female students and students of color are literally in a war zone on college campuses and need allies from the opposing side to survive. Am I exaggerating? No. Okay, so you guys are ahead of me on this. Let's look at UC Berkeley. Its Division of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, funded at $22 million a year of your taxpayer dollars, hung banners throughout the campus reminding students of the university's paramount mission, assigning guilt and innocence in the ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood. One banner featured a black female student and a male Hispanic student allegedly pleading, quote, allow people other than yourself to exist. A message directed to Berkeley's white students and faculty. This is not hyperbole, they mean it literally. College presidents are the worst offenders in encouraging this delusional victimology. After the 3-hour expletive-filled tirade against the Yale sociologist, Yale's president, Peter Salovey, actually thanked the boorish student thugs for making him proud of the student body. Yale subsequently conferred a racial justice prize on 2 of the most aggressive participants. The dean of the Harvard Medical School, just this month, removed portraits of its greatest physician scientists from the entrance hall to the school. You can guess the reason. They were all male. And thus looking on them would make Harvard's wilting medical students feel uncomfortable and unsafe. We can only wish these budding doctors luck in the operating room. Narcissistic identity politics has destroyed the serious pursuit of knowledge throughout the humanities and most of the social sciences. Students are being given a license for ignorance. All they need to know about a book is the melanin content and specific gonad configuration of its author. And we know which are the disfavored gonads. to know whether they can dismiss its contents as thoroughly repugnant and not worth reading. Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Plato, Kant, Locke, and Mills have all been variously defenestrated by students who have not the slightest clue about great writing, great ideas, or the legacy of Western civilization. A Columbia University undergraduate groused about Columbia's beleaguered core curriculum, quote, "Who is this Mozart, this Haydn, these superior white men?" The course, she said, quote, "upholds the premises of white supremacy and racism." No professor has ever defended the intellectual patrimony that is his privilege to curate against such shameful outbreaks of ecstatic know-nothingism without adding some puling qualification about respect for diversity. Now, this is just a roundabout way of getting to one of tonight's guests of honor, James Damore. What happened to Mr. Damore at Google is perhaps the last warning bell in our culture's descent into identity-driven mediocrity and thought control. We've now been put on notice. Every non-academic institution, no matter how previously meritocratic, is vulnerable to academic identity politics, and that means, above all, the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. The language that Google's CEO used in firing Mr. Damore was a direct import from academic victimology. Google's employees were, quote, "hurting," he said, because Mr. Damore had made a rational, evidence-based argument about why females are not proportionally represented at Google. Mr. Damore was humble enough not to spell out his argument in any great detail. I would just like to, in case anybody has had the misfortune of not yet reading the great 10-page memo, I would just like to counter some of the lies that were mentioned and we see with the New York Times headline. He stressed repeatedly, he's talking about distribution. He was not talking about the females at Google. He was trying to explain why there are not more of them. And he used perhaps the most inoffensive argument for describing why there is not 50-50 gender parity at Google, which is inclinations and preferences. That on average, again, we're talking about averages, males are more oriented towards abstract, data-based work, and females on average, again, not the females at Google, but on average, are more oriented towards human-based relational work. He could have added, but he did not, but I'm going to here, that there is also a multiply confirmed difference in the distribution of low-end and high-end math skills. Males predominate among math dummies, and they also predominate around the math geniuses. Males are 2.5 times more represented in the top 1% of math skills than females. That's the way it is, so be it. But for that, again, he was fired. But what followed his firing was even scarier. A regional branch of the National Labor Relations Board upheld Google's actions on the same bathos-drenched victim grounds. Mr. Damore's memo had made Google's employees feel, quote, unsafe at work, according to the NLRB Associate General Counsel. It thus constituted, quote, discrimination and sexual harassment. Now consider for a moment what this NLRB ruling means for science. Any evolutionary biologist, psychologist, or economist who studies the different risk preferences and appetite for competition among males and females is now at risk of his job. Those branches of science could be shut down completely, no matter that their findings are true. The thinking that got Mr. DeMoore fired is now the dominant characteristic of our time. It holds that the absence of exact proportional representation of various racial, ethnic, and sexual groups in any institution is by definition a result of discrimination. To suggest that different groups have different capacities, cultures, skills, and behaviors that explain the lack of proportional representation is not just taboo, it will get you fired. And so the mad rage for race and gender proportionality in the workplace is accelerating, especially in the Me Too era. From here on out, everything you read, everything you watch in the mainstream media will have been calculated in conformity with the demands of diversity. If you are a white male, no matter how talented, you're going to have to meet a higher standard to get hired or promoted. Newsrooms are under enormous pressure to find reporters, select sources, and originate stories to improve their diversity profile. Book publishers are obsessively scrutinizing their lists for diverse authors and themes. Thanks to media pressure and their own human resources departments, corporate boardrooms have made a fetish of gender proportionality. As a result, I vote against every female who shows up on a proxy ballot of a mutual fund that I own, since I assume that she's there because of her sex and not her business experience. I urge you to do the same. Get rid of them. Who needs them? Even classical music, the love of my life, is being poisoned by identity politics. New Yorker music critic Alex Ross triggered outrage against the Chicago and Philadelphia Symphony Orchestras this spring by tweeting that they had programmed no female composers in their upcoming seasons. Well, at the very moment that Alex Ross was tweeting this irrelevancy, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra was playing at Carnegie Hall, and they'd programmed Jennifer Higdon's Concerto for the Low Brass, a work commissioned by both the Philadelphia and Chicago Symphony Orchestras, undoubtedly at greatly inflated rates because Higdon is a female. It is absurd to expect gender parity in the concert hall. The reality is this: the greatest composers of all time, whether Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Chopin, or Brahms, were male. Get over it. And simply be grateful for the beauty that they gave us unworthy mortals. But classical music boards are also under enormous pressure to hire by gender and race for conducting positions and everything else. A classical music agent told me wistfully, "If only I had a trans conductor, I'd be rich." Expect that coming to your Disney Hall soon, believe me. Now, it is an unalloyed pleasure that Hollywood is being forced to sacrifice its best box office judgment to meet the demands of the race and gender bean counters. But it is in the sciences where the diversity imperative becomes actually dangerous. Every academic science department, whether physics, mathematics, or chemistry, is in the victimologist's crosshairs. The federal government is demanding that scientific departments hire based on gender and race rather than scientific merit. Science education is being slowed down and watered down in the hope of graduating more females and underrepresented minorities. An oncologist at an Ivy League medical school was berated by his dean for an exam in pharmacology that was, quote, too fact-based. I don't know about you, but if I'm going for cancer treatment, I would like my doctor to know the facts about drug interactions. Medical schools admit so-called underrepresented minorities with academic qualifications several standard deviations below their white and Asian peers. When these preference beneficiaries graduate, the federal government pressures research labs to put them on research grants. The National Science Foundation is spending billions of your taxpayer dollars on programs to boost diversity in science, arguing that only a diverse laboratory can achieve scientific breakthroughs. That's funny, because somehow the 200 National Science Foundation grantees who won Nobel Prizes managed to discover dark matter and the genetics of viruses, among other breakthroughs, without conforming to today's diversity metrics. And of course, the mania for gender and race parity in science continues into the private sector. After Mr. Damore was fired, a human resources manager sued YouTube and Google for firing him because he had refused to go along with the mandate to interview only females, blacks, and Hispanics for entry-level engineering jobs. Potentially groundbreaking scientists are being passed over today because they are of the wrong race and gender. Guess who does not care about diversity metrics? China. The best thing President Trump could do to level the playing field would be to airlift a few cargo planes of gender theorists from American universities and dump them on Beijing University and its science labs. Get rid of them. Throw her out. Lock her up. But until that happens, however, China is going to inexorably pull out ahead since it cares only about one thing: scientific accomplishment. Academic identity politics is tearing our society apart. It is teaching young people to hate the greatest thinkers and creators of the past, and to hate their fellow Americans. I fear that a race war may be in the making, or even a broader civil war, as we've seen in this last week, with the attacks egged on by our Maxine Waters to go after Trump cabinet members. The diversity delusion, therefore, has to be nipped in the bud. The next time self-engrossed students occupy a campus building demanding more reparations, here is what the college president should say: "Are you kidding me? You are the most privileged individuals in human history. You have at your fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for: knowledge. You are surrounded by libraries that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with desire and envy. You can read any book that has ever been written. You have access to scientific laboratories that are the most advanced in the world, and they are all open to you as long as you put in the effort to learn. You can pursue languages, literature, and history. Everything is available. Far from discriminating against minorities and females in hiring, every faculty search here is one desperate effort to find remotely qualified, underrepresented female and minority candidates who have not already been scooped up by better endowed schools. Far from discriminating against underrepresented minorities in admissions, we employ double standards in order to engineer so-called diversity. I can assure you that my faculty are not bigots. They have nothing but goodwill for history's oppressed groups and want all their students to succeed. As for your fellow students, they just want to make friends and connections and net a degree with as little work as possible. At this very moment, millions of Chinese students are studying night and day for the privilege of experiencing this alleged maelstrom of hatred. If you feel so oppressed, step aside and let them take your place. But a college president never says any of these things, of course. Instead, he is silent before these outbreaks of narcissistic delusion, happy to sell out his faculty as alleged bigots, and penitently promising to make amends for so mistreating the oppressed students. It becomes imperative, therefore, for other institutions to rebut the victimology narrative. It is not enough to call for freedom of expression. That is, if I may borrow a term, a relatively safe stance to take. Even some liberals will back you up. No, if we're going to restore both sanity and civil harmony, we are going to have to take on the victimology narrative directly and assert that racism and oppression are not the predominant characteristics of American society today. For all our historical flaws, and they were real, there has never been a more tolerant, opportunity-filled polity than our present one. And for that truth-telling mission, there is no organization more important than the American Freedom Alliance. Thank you for your attention.